Thank you for joining us, Joel. Welcome back to Her First 3 Years, a very special episode where you are honorary co host here.
I'm so excited. Thank you for inviting me to do this. I can't wait to see what we get into.
Yeah, we've got some great conversations, things that every entrepreneur experiences. Even some of you in corporate still might resonate with a lot of these topics. It can be how we show up, how we communicate, relationship building, and we'll talk about all of that. But let's start first. I kind of want to start a little different than what we were thinking, which is let's talk about selling and sales and putting yourself out there because I know this has been coming up a lot from people that you've spoken to, you've done a training on it. What do you think it is that gets us so caught up in it that makes it so challenging to move forward? I've got my own thoughts on this, but I want to get your input first.
Okay, I am dying to know what your experience was like, both from your side, right? Like you coming up in business, but then also the women you work with. For me, I recently came out of doing this six-part series as a webinar. And even before that, there were three or four more calls. So my series is called Nail Your Sales. And it's really interesting because you might think executive coach, what is she doing talking about sales? And it's because the coaching conversation, like if you're a certified coach with ICF, it's very similar to the framework you would want to use when you're talking to someone with the potential of selling to them. And there have been so many interesting discoveries coming up because I designed the six-part webinar series with role plays with every one of those calls. So, can you imagine if we had a call together? And maybe this is something we do one day in the future again if you bring me back. But I had role players queued up for like the kind of scenarios to practice these things. And so there was like, the art of listening, and then there was how to respond. And I think it's the listening is like a huge barrier. So people have a hard time with listening because they're so caught up in themselves and they're experiencing anxiety. I see you smiling. How do I maneuver this conversation so that I can pitch them so they will then sign up with me? How do I persuade them? So they're already coming from like this persuading, convincing energy. But then the second part of that is because they're rooted in what I would call like not the best energy, that causes them to respond like a weirdo. Like, I'm just going to throw it out there. Actually, I have a question for you. When's the last time you went into a sales call as a customer where you thought it was really good?
Never. That has never happened. In fact, I had one time where I loved this company. It was a company I really respected, and I loved what the founder was doing, and I would have completely bought what they were selling. I was on the call for a reason, and the person was so bad at selling and had that awkward energy you're talking about, that was the reason why I did not buy, and I was tempted to write the founder and say, "Look, something's up with his training, this person, I don't know, but I was ready to spend multiple figures on your business, and I'm not gonna spend anything now."
So if you think about that, I don't know how clearly you remember it, but like what's the number one thing that you went from, I'm like, I just need you to tell me where to sign up, and then they unsold you. Do you remember, like, what moment that was?
I love this. We should call this unsold. Yes, this is a great question. The moment that I think it shifted for me was when it felt like I was being talked to on a script. So he wasn't listening for my answers before jumping into the next section, which is what you talked about. He was so set on how do I pivot to this sale that he didn't hear what I was communicating with why I needed this or what my objections were. It was straight into the next format of this is how I get her sold essentially.
So, I think that feeling when we know that they're on a script, right? They're not paying attention. So, they're not actually incorporating what you just told them. And so then the conversation takes, like, weird, abrupt turns, which leaves you like you feel like you're kinda being yanked around, but then that feeling of not being listened to, it starts to for me, it's it starts to build, like, this rage inside. I'm like, "Why am I here?" So I recently had this encounter with a stylist, I was looking for a personal stylist to help me, I was like, "Look at you, man. Like, you have your beautiful silk-looking robe and like you have a brand. Like, your look is very distinct and I want something like that." So, I signed up for oh, okay, let me tell you. First, it was a bait and switch. My friend forwarded me this woman's story because she said offering free styling audit. And I was like, "Oh, that sounds amazing." So, I clicked the button and then there's already a breakdown in the process because she instead sends me like a PDF on how to build a six-figure business as a stylist. And I was like, uh, I'm confused. So like I literally text that back. I'm like, I'm confused. I thought I was signing up for like an audit. And she was like, "Oh, I'm sorry, my assistant sent you the wrong thing." And so we set up a time to talk. We get on the call and her approach, I don't know what it is, and I see this with creative so much, but there's, like, this judgy, condescending energy, and so she had, like, the negging approach, like, do you know what I mean?
But explain it for everyone listening because you wanna hear this, if not for business, for if you're dating.
Yes. So in dating terminology, negging is like where you're putting that person down and it's like manipulative because the theory is that, for instance, like pretty women need to be treated like garbage for them to want you. It's the same kind of thing. So you treat them poorly, you tell them, they're ugly or like they're repulsive in some way. And same thing in sales. I see this all the time. So you've gotten those DMs, right? Where it's like, "Hey, Sade, I love what you're doing, but your website sucks and you should be doing better." Or, "I went through your email sequence and these emails are horrible." It's like that. That's kind of what happened here. And I was so agitated by this experience. I laid it out in a post. And I was like, I showed up super excited, but then the way she started talking to me, like I was so upset by it. She called my style nondescript. She went through my Instagram and she started showing me pictures of me. She was like, "Yeah, your style is very nondescript." She asked me where I shopped. I tell her the stores and she's like, "Yeah, you're never gonna stand out if you shop at places like that. You're gonna just look like everyone else." Like, I remember this moment, I was like so taken aback, you know? I don't know how you deal with people like that, but I was taken aback and I was like, well, that's kind of why I'm sitting here in front of you because I need your help.
This is where it's almost like it well, let's reframe this way. Let's say that we are in this conversation and I'm the stylist and you're coming to this conversation again. What would you want me to ask you or to point out that would start to invite this idea of, "Oh, I wanna work with her," or, "I'm sure I know that I want to." Like, what would be, let's say, the first 2 things I point out or the questions I ask you that would make you feel excited about talking to me more?
Oh my God, that's such a good question. So, the beginning of the conversation I thought was off to a good start. She said, "What are your goals with your style?" And I said, "Oh, well, I feel like my brand doesn't match what I do as an executive coach." And I said, "I really want my look to reflect my personality. So if you were in front of me, like who you are today, and you were to ask me, what is your personality?" Like such a basic question. She never asked me.
She already had a preconceived idea about your solution instead of saying, like, "What are the adjectives you describe your personality?" If I ask you, "What are 3 ways you describe your personality that you feel are not coming across if someone doesn't meet you in person?"
So I think when people meet me in person, my personality comes through like full force. It's not coming through online. That's the issue. So I have a tendency to dress down when I show up online because I just want to be comfortable. So I wear athleisure, right? So adjectives, I'm extremely direct. I tend to be very sharp. Like people have used the words like sharp, cutting, multiple people. I feel like you're going to laugh. They say that sometimes when I say certain things, they feel like a hand just slapped them. So, right? Like, I feel like that's kind of a vibe, right? Like, what I'm describing, and maybe it lines up with what she had in mind, but I have no idea because she never asked me.
'Cause she never really got that far, right? Because she jumped straight into it. But it would be interesting because right from there, I know nothing about, like, stylist stuff, by the way, although I do have someone I'm gonna recommend to you after this call. I can dress myself, I couldn't dress other people. Now I'm saying this because even without knowing that, but just having the background in sales, I can already see how the next question would be, "Okay, what do you think about these kind of shapes and textures?" You're telling me that you like really that you're a very direct person, it can be sharp. What do you think about some angular stuff? Maybe some, I don't know, like triangle type earrings or more like firm patterns. What do you think about primary colors? And I would just maybe start to ask your feelings on that stuff to get an idea of, okay, how does this fit with what I do? Rather than let me slap on executive coach look to you.
I already love it. I already feel like I wanna give you my money with this. That approach would have worked with me. Okay, so here's what where this actually went. I asked her if she's ever seen the show Suits. Have you seen that show?
I've seen that show, yeah.
Okay, so I asked her and she said she was familiar. And I said, "Okay, you know how Jessica Pearson and Donna Paulson dress? It's somewhere, like, in between those 2." So for me, that's, like, very specific, right? Like, you have a visual reference if you've seen the show. And that would have been, like, such an easy jumping off point there. It just be like, "Okay, so do you have examples of which outfits or, like, which episodes? Do you have anything pinned? Do you have stuff saved of their outfits? Like, what about their jewelry, accessories?" She maneuvered the conversation away from Suits. Like, she even cut me off. She started talking over me. So that was the other killer here is, maybe some people don't mind that, but I mind that hugely. Like, that's like the fastest way to really make me angry is if you don't let me finish speaking. And I'm like, so what I realized in that conversation, which I think you know this well. Okay, by the way, can I just say I never knew you had a background in sales. I'm like, what? Where have you been hiding this tidbit?
This is a whole nother conversation. For the last decade, I've been trapped in the practitioner world, which is very different. But when I was in corporate, that was all I did was sales. And then obviously as an entrepreneur, you're in sales anyway, like you're developing that skill. But yeah, now it's full circle. I'm going back. I want to point out something that you said, which was really interesting about how you told her exactly what you wanted. You literally gave her the magic key, which is said suits. This is the key. Take the key. I feel like people don't listen to keywords. And then she could have pulled up a picture if she didn't know and said, "Do you mean like this? Or what do you like about this?" And instead, what she did, which I'm guessing, is it sounds like she was insecure about the fact that she didn't know. And rather than come across as unaware or uninformed, she jumped to what she knew or putting you in your place.
Yeah, and I think what you just described is what I've seen in the role plays over and over and over, like so many times. I have one client, she's a photographer. She was afraid of asking for people like, "Hey, can I just take a second and look this up like on Google?" And I'm like, "Why wouldn't you?" And it's the fear of looking stupid or looking dumb in some way, looking incompetent, like not an expert in your profession. And I was like, "You know what makes you look worse is when you just gloss over it and keep going like you're some like bulldozer." Yeah, so that was totally it. I'm like, if she had just said, "Oh, I'm kind of familiar, but I haven't watched too many episodes. Can I take a second and just Google this?" And if she had just pulled up some images and then like shared screen and then, looked at these, I could have just pointed straight at like pieces, colors. She could have used that as a springboard for what you said earlier. What do you think of these kind of colors? Or what about these kind of accessories? What about these shapes? This neckline. It's so easy. But no, she did what you said. So I think the combination of her entire approach, it was just I was so upset after the call, I cried. I felt horrible about myself. And so there were so many lessons to be learned about this call because I was like, number 1, I realized it almost felt like a violation because when a buyer gets on a call with you, they expect to be the center of attention. They expect to be the center of attention. And so in my mind, it's like you're a dancer preparing to take the stage. And then you, as the seller, you're there to shine the spotlight on them. But what happens with most sellers is they shove you off the stage. Literally, you're trying to dance and they just push you off the stage. And then what's even worse is then they start dancing on the stage for you. And it's like, I don't think you understand the purpose of this call here. Otter showed me she spoke 70% of the time. And some of the calls that I review for people, they're typically speaking 70, 80, or even 85% of the time. And I'm like, you're literally talking so much the other person can't even tell you what they want to tell you.
It's so interesting this idea of how you're helping people with the training on this of having them mimic it, do it, and then looking not just at the content of what they say, but the percentage that they're speaking. I always think about sales as it's primarily active listening. You're essentially trying to figure out what is the solution they need and how do they need you to phrase it. And of course, I also believe in ethically doing it. So, does it even make sense? I think is another thing we need to add on there so it's not slimy. But you can't determine that if you don't ask these questions and you don't listen to the key things that they're bringing up for you, where it goes from a in the bank going to be sold to never gonna happen. I'm so upset and I'm gonna use this as my social media post. What do you think is the with sales? So we know that okay, active listening is definitely missing and spotlighting the person instead of taking your own stage. What do you think is another common error that people make? And even could be something that you had to learn along the way too.
I mean, everything I'm telling you. Oh, wait, so before we talk about that piece, let's like dial back to when you said active listening, because I find that after doing 9 of these calls, people are very quick to say, yeah, yeah, like active listening. I'm a great listener. So you would laugh at this. On the posts, I asked people, where they sign up for the webinars and stuff. I would ask people, like, how would you rate your listening skills on 1 to 10? And you know how many people put 8, 9, and 10 for their
All of
listening
them?
skills? Yes. Right? And I'm like, I would rate myself a 7, and I feel like I'm pretty certain that I'm a better listener than all of those people. So, if you've been in sales, I don't know how you even got into it. How did you learn what active listening was?
I have a really unusual pivot into sales. So, my first job out of university, and it was something I did in my last semester as well, is I was a research assistant for someone who was writing a book that was interview based with different business owners and tech people. And so, my job was literally to listen to these interviews because this was pre transcription available by AI free, like pop everything into whatever. And so I had to look for keywords, phrases. I had to physically write or type what they said. And I also was in charge of coming up with questions based on different articles that were written about these people. And there was very small margin for error because they were huge people. Like they're some of the biggest in the world. And so I couldn't go in with topics or there was no room for error essentially because the person who was going to be asking these questions, my boss, it would be she'd be on the line or she'd get sued. So I had to learn very early how do you listen and how do you summarize and be that person. So I feel like when I went into sales, it was very natural and we can talk about this separately, but the whole way I got the job was essentially selling my interviewer on what I could do, right? Which is what a job interview is. It was a weird, unusual path in.
Wow. Okay, so how old were you when you did that research?
I was 23.
Dang, man. Okay, so you figured out these skills because of that position, like so much, or like 20 years earlier than I did.
How did you figure out what was it that got it for you?
It was going into coaching. And so just being an introvert, I'm already more of a listener than, say, extroverts are. But I also spend a lot of time just in like deep thinking by myself, where I'll review incidents in the day. So, like, if we talk about self doubt or imposter syndrome, and people will often ask me, how did you get over those? And I'm like, this is going to sound silly, but I just sat around thinking about why these situations triggered me so much. And so that was a component is like, really thinking through why it was, and so I think that's already different. Like, most people will just fall down what I call the hole. They're in the tornado of the feelings, and they're just, like, triggered AF. They don't actually look at why are you triggered to that degree? And so I was already more on the listening side, but it was because I went into coach training. So coach training programs started to really nail some of these pieces in place, but I found it really lacking because this is like, I'm not throwing shade on any programs out there. I realize it's a miracle that you have any coaches coming out of any program who don't suck, because it is incredibly hard to teach. You know, like if you've done sales and if you've ever tried to teach people sales, I think you know what I mean. It's because it's the same skill set. It's incredibly hard to try and teach people this like intangible because it's like a compounded layer upon layer upon layer of people skills all at once. That's what makes it so hard.